in the 40s, and only now, in 1862, it's done and published. And this book deals with the rule of Ivan IV through the lens of another nobleman, Knjaz Serebrjannyj, although this is not a real historical person. And nowadays, Tolstoy is much more remembered for his plays, which also deal with the rule of Ivan, or his poems, although it's still not super easy to really sort him into one of the political camps at the time, and he himself describes his reception in literary circles with the following quote: "While the radical journals brand me a retrograde, the government considers me a revolutionary." So while he was opposing extremism in all forms, he also did support some of the reforms and is kind of just caught between chairs. At least that's how he perceived himself. So let's look at what's actually going on in the book that he wrote. And his Ivan is introduced to the audience with the following quote: "The expression of his face was also completely changed, even as a building after a fire. The walls are still there, but all the ornaments are burned away." And this, I think, immediately sets the mood. Like, this is a very tragic figure. We see something is gone. There used to be, something there, a beautiful building, and now it's just a ruin. So immediately we think of Ivan as a tragic and struggling figure, and this is reflected within the book, where he questions his faith and whether his rulership is right the way he does it. But on the other hand, we have this second quote describing how the people actually in Russia at the time experience his rule. And this makes it pretty clear. Of executions, there is no end. Blood flows daily in the prisons, and even in the holy monasteries themselves. So we really see Ivan crossing even the final boundaries, the final rules, and shedding blood in monasteries. And so while he is a tragic figure, he is also very clearly sadistic and ordering many executions and even manipulating his own men and constantly playing them against one another. So overall, this is very clearly a negative view that we have here, which, as you can already imagine, was not too popular with the Slavophiles and quite conflicting with their view on Ivan, because at the time he wasn't this set as Ivan the Terrible as we know him now, even though, of course, that's also kind of a mistranslation. So Tolstoy deliberately chose to make his Ivan more negative. This was a conscious decision, because we can see he did quite a lot of research. He read the Kurbsky letters, which you can really see in the way he writes Ivan's dialogue. And more especially, he read Karamzin's History of the Russian State, which came out just a few decades prior. And he likes this work so much, sometimes he just quotes entire paragraphs in his book and just writes them in there. So his Ivan is very extensively researched, his entire book is, but Tolstoy himself even admits that he does some deliberate changes even from the research that he did. But what can we gather from Tolstoy's view on the autocratic system? How is it portrayed within this book? And even in his own afterword, Tolstoy says, let us forget the sinful shade of Tsar Ivan, for he does not bear the responsibility of his deeds alone. And I feel like this is extremely telling. Tolstoy sees fault within the entire system and within everyone. It's not just Ivan, it's also the people around him that keep him on this terrible path. And even the main character himself, in the end, says, "May God forgive the Tsar. You too are to blame for sitting quietly and watching all these things happening without protests." So Tolstoy himself continually raises the question, are you allowed to question the Tsar? I mean, he's the God-ordained ruler. But his answer, as you can see here, is yes, because if you don't, then everything stays as bad as it is. Nothing will change. And so Tolstoy very much seems to be in support of resistance without betraying the empire itself. Like, he obviously judges Kurbsky, who did leave Russia to defect to Lithuania. And Tolstoy himself treats the Tsars that he worked for quite similarly. Like, for example, when Alexander had sent several people into exile for their political opinions. Even though Tolstoy didn't even agree with these political opinions, he petitioned the Tsar to bring them back because he didn't think it was right. And so not only that, but he also seems to have been very much in support of a constitutional monarchy for Russia. And Tolstoy also sees nobility as a balancing force. Despite all of this, he was very much in support of a hierarchy within society. And I think this is not that surprising with him himself being a nobleman and also his main character being a nobleman in the book, and all the heroes are basically nobility who stand up to Ivan's terrible rule. But yeah, let's also look at an example of someone who, in Tolstoy's opinion, Ivan is corrupting. And I think the most prominent example of all the oprichniki is actually Fyodor Basmanov, who is described as a youth of about 20 years of age, of extraordinary beauty, but a very unpleasant expression. And at the same time, he's more richly dressed than the others. And at first, this again seems to align perfectly with what Karam-Zin says in his History of the Russian State, because he describes Fyodor as beautiful of face, but of a mean soul. And so also both of them agree that he was one of Ivan's favorite, and they even talk about the fact that several sources do mention a sexual relationship between the two of them, and that he very enthusiastically participated in Ivan's reign and all the cruel acts in the executions, that he was quite sadistic. But here's where the differences come in. Tolstoy's Fyodor is quite dissatisfied, while Karam-Zin and also other sources mention the fact that Fyodor Basmanov had military leadership. He was part of the Oprichnina Duma, so an important political organ. And he had risen quite high within the ranks of Ivan's court. Here, we just have a young man who, is unhappy, doesn't get any positions, and feels very underappreciated by Ivan, and he does voice this. But an even bigger change that Tolstoy made to this figure actually comes in now. And you can first see it when he describes him as wearing his hair long, in contrast to them being the other men working for Ivan. He had no beard and was exceedingly effeminate looking. And then also the start of the second quote, he used to dance like a girl. Like here we have a major new factor that Tolstoy introduces, where Fyodor is not just androgynous, he's not just lacking some of his titles. In fact, he cross-dresses for Ivan and performs dances for him, against his will, mind you. Several times within the book, the entire court, which knows about it, makes fun of Fyodor, and Fyodor runs up to Ivan and is like, please just give me a high position at court so they can stop ridiculing me. And Ivan is like, no, you're here to provide entertainment. So again, Ivan is portrayed as very cruel and, basically forcing this young man into a position that he doesn't even want to be in. And yet we have the remaining part of the second quote, where it says, and now he shows such courage. He has evidently collected the peasants and has learned to feel that he is a Russian. And this happens the one time that Fyodor is outside of the sphere of Ivan's influence, and he is actually out on a battlefield, leading the troops, fighting Russian enemies. And so we really see what Tolstoy pictured as Russian here. And you can also see it in the portrait of Tsar Alexander. It's succeeding in military exploits. It's fulfilling these masculine ideals. Tolstoy's Fyodor very much is turned into this Orientalist motive of this young guy who's cross-dressing for the entertainment of a despotic ruler. And it's probably even inspired by the practice of batshabazi, which happened in, for example, Afghanistan. So places that were even part of the Russian Empire itself, but very much viewed as like remote, kind of uncivilized regions. So Tolstoy's readers would not just see this as Orientalist, but they would immediately have this connection, are these parts of our empire even really Russian? And he also turns the, hints of their same-sex relationship into something way different and way more problematic by adding all these crossings of gender boundaries, by making Fyodor unmanly. Because same-sex in Tolstoy's time was not that much of a big deal between men. Like, yes, it was outlawed, but it wasn't a huge deal within society and not widely prosecuted. So he really said, no, we're adding Orientalism on top to really show how bad it gets. And so it's pretty clear to see where he viewed the Russian Empire. And he says it himself in a letter to a friend. I come to the conclusion that the Russians are Europeans and not Mongols. And I think we've also seen this with Fyodor and Ivan. They are confronted with all these Orientalist motives in their own conflict, in their characterizations. And all the conflicts in Tolstoy's book are basically a fight against the Oriental other. Like also his main character, heroically, when he decides he can't serve Ivan, still serves Russia by going to die in the battlefield against the Tartars. So yeah, the message is pretty obvious with that one. And here we really see how Tolstoy really added a whole layer on top of his historical research, rewrites history to bring his points to the audience. And yeah, this vision does live on. There were actually two movies made in 1991 out of his book, which reached kind of cult status, at least one of them. And even at the time, it was widely received and translated several times. So this is not just an obscure book from 1860. It has quite the long reception history. And then we also see other creators, like Eisenstein, for example, once again use Ivan to discuss their views on, strong one-man rulership, autocratic systems. And interestingly enough, we once again have Fyodor cross-dressing and dancing for him, and yet it's used very differently and without all these layers of Orientalism. Yeah, so that was my presentation on Tolstoy. Here are my sources, and I look forward to your questions.